In a luxurious mansion where silence hid fear, everyone lived in the shadow of a bride known for her relentless coldness. Employees came and went without leaving a trace, while rumors of humiliation and cruelty spread through the corridors like a constant warning. Until the arrival of a simple employee without power or influence began to provoke subtle changes that no one could explain. But what seemed like mere kindness hid a truth capable of shaking even the most hardened heart. Before discovering how this surprising story transformed everything, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more moving reports like this one. The mansion's electronic gate opened with a metallic groan, as if the structure itself were reluctant to receive visitors. Renata Siqueira stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, her rolling suitcase by her side, and observed the property that awaited her. It was the largest house she had ever seen up close, a palace of glass and reinforced concrete, surrounded by impeccable gardens in the most exclusive part of Alphaville, in the municipality of Barueri, in Greater São Paulo. There was a fountain in the center of the front garden, and the water gushing from it seemed clearer than the water she drank at home. Renata took a deep breath, adjusted the bag strap over her shoulder, and crossed the gate. There was no room for hesitation. Her mother needed her. Dona Aparecida Siqueira had been diagnosed 3 months earlier with a rare kidney disease. The treatment was expensive, the sessions were long and frequent, and Renata's salary as an administrative assistant in a stationery store in downtown Osasco barely covered the rent for the room they shared in a narrow boarding house in Vila Yara. When the job offer appeared, advertised by a high-end domestic agency service, she read the ad 3 times before believing it. Caregiver and general services assistant in a luxury residence, generous salary, housing included, immediate start. She didn't ask much. She signed the contract, hugged her mother tightly, and came. The woman who received her at the service door was not the mistress. It was Ghislaine, the housekeeper for 7 years in that house, a lady with dyed black hair and a starched apron, who evaluated her from head to toe with a look that wasn't exactly hostile, but wasn't welcoming either. She showed the room, small and clean, at the back of the house, listed the rules in a monotonous voice, and ended with a sentence that Renata would not forget. Stay quiet, do what they tell you, and do not draw the attention of Dr. Vivian. Renata didn't ask who Dr. Vivian was. Over the next 2 days, she didn't need to ask. The house had 15 employees between permanent staff and day workers. Everyone walked as if the floor were made of glass. Steps were quick, conversations were whispered, and eyes were always raised to the upper floor as if expecting something to fall. Renata realized there was an unwritten protocol. Never cross the main hallway when you heard high heels. Never leave anything out of place in the blue room, which was the favorite environment of the master's bride. Never, ever enter the upper floor without being called. It was on the 3rd day that Renata saw Vivian Montero for the first time. It was almost noon when the woman descended the central staircase with the bearing of someone who rehearsed every movement. She wore a white linen set that seemed to have been sewn directly onto her body, and her dark hair was tied in a bun, so precise it looked like sculptural work. She was beautiful in an intimidating way, with sharp features and dark brown eyes that didn't blink much. Passing through the kitchen, she stopped before the buffet, where the staff was setting up lunch, and stood looking for exactly 4 seconds before speaking. The cilantro on the plate was not supposed to be here. I said cilantro on the edge. On the edge. No one answered. The cook, Edna, just lowered her head and began to reorganize the plate with hands that were visibly trembling. Vivian stood still for 2 more seconds, turned, and left without saying anything else. Renata, who was watching from the pantry door with a dish towel in her hand, saw the cook quickly wipe her eyes before anyone noticed. That night, Renata sat on the bed in her little room and thought. Not about leaving. She had already considered that on the 2nd day, but she pushed the thought away with the same firmness with which she pushed away fatigue after a long shift. She thought about how she was going to survive in that environment without becoming another cowering person. And she reached a simple conclusion which she had carried since childhood, taught by her mother with short words and long examples. Kindness costs nothing, but it is worth a lot. The next day, when she arrived at the kitchen before her shift, Renata prepared a stronger coffee just the way Edna liked it, without anyone asking. The cook looked at her with suspicion before accepting the cup. After a moment of silence, she said, "Thank you." Just that. But it was the first warm word Renata had heard in that house. The other employees began to notice, not immediately because suspicion was etched into each of their reflexes, but Renata did small things. She picked up a cloth that fell before someone tripped, remembered everyone's name from the first day, asked if they needed help when she saw someone overwhelmed. It wasn't theatrical. It was just her way. What she didn't know yet was that the house's greatest responsibility was locked in a room on the upper floor, which no one ascended to with goodwill, and that it would be precisely through that door, on a Saturday of light rain, that her life in that mansion would take a completely unexpected direction. The master was named Enrique Montanaro. Renata had only seen him from a distance, a tall figure with broad shoulders, who entered and left the garage with a cell phone to his ear and the expression of someone who never stopped thinking. He was the owner of a logistics conglomerate that operated in 6 states, and his presence in the mansion was irregular and brief. What remained, however, was the trail of his power, felt in every detail of the decoration, in every employee who knew exactly what their place was. On the Friday of her second week, Ghislaine called Renata for a conversation. "You will go upstairs to take care of Donna Hercilia starting tomorrow, morning and afternoon." Renata asked who Donna Hercilia was. "Dr. Henrique's mother. She is in the back room on the top floor. She has memory and mobility problems. Several people have already passed through there." Ghislaine paused before continuing. "None stayed more than 2 weeks. Renata didn't ask why. She accepted. When she climbed the stairs that Saturday morning and knocked softly on the door of Donna Hercilia's room, she prepared herself for the unknown. What she found was a woman with completely white hair sitting in a blue velvet armchair, looking out the window with an expression that wasn't exactly sadness, but was something neighboring it. The room smelled of medicine and stagnant air. The curtains blocked almost all natural light. Renata greeted her with a calm voice. The lady did not respond immediately. After a long moment, she turned her head slowly and looked at Renata with eyes that seemed to try to reach something that was just beyond reach. "You are new," the lady said. "Yes," Renata replied with a smile. "My name is Renata. I came to keep you company." Donna Hercilia went back to looking out the window. Renata, instead of standing still waiting for an order, walked to the window and lightly opened the curtains. The grey light of the rainy morning entered softly. The lady did not protest. She stood looking at the wet garden for a moment, and then very quietly said something Renata could barely hear. "It's been a long time since anyone opened this window for me." The days that followed in that room were different from anything Renata had found in the rest of the mansion. While downstairs the air carried tension, and the employees moved like pieces on a board where any mistake was punished, Donna Hercilia's room was a suspended space, out of time, where the common rules of the house seemed not to reach. The lady lived at her own pace, sometimes lucid and articulate, sometimes lost in memories that only she could see. Renata learned quickly. She didn't try to correct when the lady called out the name of someone who wasn't there. She didn't force conversation when the silence came. She sat nearby, organized the room with slow and deliberate movements, and waited. She learned that Donna Hercilia liked music when the day was cloudy, that she hated the smell of lavender in the air, and that her favorite dish was rice with chicken and potato sticks, which rarely appeared on the menu prepared especially for her. In the second week of care, Renata brought a small battery-powered radio she had found in one of the service area cabinets. She asked Ghislaine if she could use it. The housekeeper shrugged, indifferent. That afternoon, when she placed the device in the room and found a station playing old Brazilian songs, Donna Hercilia became completely motionless for a few seconds. Then, very slowly, she began to move her fingers over the fabric of the armchair, to the rhythm of the melody. "I know this one," the lady said. "My little Henrique used to dance with me when this song played." Renata said nothing. She just smiled and continued arranging the folded blankets on the bed. It was that afternoon that something changed in Donna Hercilia's room. It was subtle in the order of things that one only notices when paying attention with the whole body, not just the eyes. The tension the lady carried in her shoulders, that rigidity that seemed permanent, had diminished a little. She was still a sick woman, she still had bad days and moments of confusion, but there was something lighter in her posture when Renata was present. What Renata didn't know was that the room had a window positioned so that a part of the upper floor hallway was visible to anyone on the lower floor looking from the right angle of the staircase, and that Enrique Montanaro, on one of the rare occasions he arrived early from work, had stopped on the middle step of the staircase because of an unusual sound, the faint, almost faded laughter of his mother. He stood still for a long moment. Then he went up slowly, reached the ajar door of the room and looked in without entering. He saw Renata sitting on the floor next to the armchair, reading aloud from a storybook she had found on a shelf in the room, an old book with a worn cover. Donna Hercilia listened with half-closed eyes, a ghost of a smile on her face. Enrique stayed in that position long enough to feel something move inside his chest. It wasn't exactly longing, because longing assumes that the thing went away and remained absent. It was more like the relief of seeing that a window that seemed locked forever could still be opened. He went down without making a sound, but that image remained. Vivian Montero had also noticed the new employee, but for completely different reasons. Vivian was a woman who lived by control. It wasn't a characteristic she had chosen consciously. It was something that had developed over the years like armor, so integrated into her personality that she no longer knew how to distinguish where the protection ended and the person began. She controlled the temperature of the house, the arrangement of the furniture, the weekly menu, the staff schedules, and Enrique's mood as much as possible. In exchange, the house functioned with a precision that satisfied her. What didn't work as it should were the people who showed no fear of her. Renata Siqueira was that person. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't insolence. Vivian had encountered insolence a few times and knew how to deal with it. Immediate dismissal without discussion. What was in Renata was something else, something Vivian didn't know how to name immediately. The girl fulfilled all tasks, arrived on time, never left anything out of place. But when they crossed in the hallway, Renata didn't lower her eyes. Not in a defiant way, but with the naturalness of someone who simply wasn't afraid to be seen. This bothered Vivian in a way she wouldn't admit, even to herself. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that the first confrontation happened. Vivian had entered the kitchen to check the dinner menu. She found Renata helping Edna carry heavy pots to the stove, something that wasn't exactly her job. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. "You are not in your sector," Vivian said. Renata raised her face. "I'm sorry, Dr. Vivian. I was passing by and saw that Edna needed help with the pots. I'll finish soon and go back upstairs." "You were hired to take care of the elderly woman, not to circulate through the kitchen." "Donna Hercilia is resting. I took advantage of the break." The voice was serene, without any rise in tone. "But I apologize if I went outside protocol. It won't happen again." Vivian stood looking for a few seconds longer than necessary. She expected nervousness. She expected that visible recoil people gave when she hardened her voice. Instead, she received a direct, calm response, without aggression, but also without submission. It was like pushing a wall that doesn't give way but also doesn't push back. She left the kitchen without responding. Edna waited 5 full seconds before releasing the breath she had held. She looked at Renata with an expression that mixed admiration and panic. "Aren't you afraid of her?" she whispered. Renata thought for a moment before responding. "I have respect. Fear is different." Edna shook her head, as if that were the most courageous and at the same time the most naive statement she had heard in years. But she said nothing more. That night, lying in the narrow bed of her little room, Renata thought of her mother. She called the boarding house, heard Donna Aparecida's voice, which sounded a bit more tired than the previous week, but which insisted on saying she was fine. Renata sent the money she had managed to save from the first fortnight. Then she hung up and lay looking at the concrete ceiling that the room divider didn't quite reach. She knew she was in a house where kindness was interpreted as weakness, where gentleness was suspicious, where any gesture of care seemed out of place like a flower growing between stones. But that was exactly why she wasn't going to stop, because a flower between stones is the one that draws the most attention. And she didn't even imagine how much she would be watched in the days to come. Because on the other side of the hallway that same night, Viviane Montero stood in front of the bathroom mirror for longer than usual. She wasn't admiring herself. She was thinking. There was something in those eyes of Renata's that remained present in her memory, like a song that won't leave your head. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't arrogance, but it was firm. Viviane had spent years building a reputation that pushed people away, and it worked very well. No one stayed close enough to see beneath the surface. That was how she wanted it. That was how she felt safe. So why did an employee she barely knew disturb her so much? She closed the faucet harder than she intended, wrapped the towel around her shoulders, and left the bathroom. There was no answer she wanted to explore at that moment. There were more urgent things to manage, but the thought remained there, like a door slightly ajar that the wind insists on pushing. The crisis happened on a Thursday night, when the mansion was already quiet, and most of the employees had retired to their rooms or left for their homes. Renata was almost falling asleep when she heard the sound. It wasn't exactly a scream. It was something more primitive, a vocalization between a cry and a call that pierced the walls and reached her with an urgency that required no interpretation. She got out of bed in seconds, slipped her feet into slippers and climbed the stairs without turning on the hallway lights so as not to startle anyone further. When she entered Donna Hercelia's room, she found the lady standing next to the bed, disoriented, with wide eyes and arms outstretched as if trying to balance on a floor that was moving. The radio had fallen from the table and was playing low in the corner of the wall. The curtains had been partially ripped from the rod, as if the lady had clung to them during sleep. "Don't leave me here," Donna Hercelia was saying, repeating the phrase in a rhythm that followed no external logic. "Don't leave me here alone." Renata didn't scream for help. She didn't run to grab her. She walked slowly toward the lady, speaking in a low and steady voice, like someone walking toward a bird that is about to fly. "I'm here, Donna Hercelia. Can you see me? It's me, Renata. I'm here with you." The lady turned her face toward the voice. Her eyes were still lost, but something in them recognized the sound. "Who?" "Renata, the girl who opens the window for you in the morning." A pause. A slow blink. The lady's face was, very gradually, reorganizing itself. Renata reached her and held her hands firmly, without squeezing too much, just enough to offer an anchor. "Are you cold?" Renata asked. The lady didn't answer, but she stopped repeating the phrase. Renata guided her back to the bed with slow movements, adjusted the blanket, picked up the radio from the floor, and placed it back on the side table, finding a frequency playing a very soft instrumental waltz. She sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there. She didn't leave when the rhythm of the lady's breathing normalized. She stayed until Donna Hercelia's eyes closed again. Only then did she realize she wasn't alone in the hallway. Enrique Montanaro was standing in the doorway. He had arrived late from a meeting in São Paulo and was still in his suit, his tie loosened, the expression of someone who had run to the room upon hearing the sounds. When he saw that the situation was controlled, he didn't enter. He stood still, watching Renata sit in silence next to the sleeping mother, and something in his face changed in a way he wouldn't have been able to describe in words. Renata only noticed him when she was about to get up to leave. She swallowed her surprise at seeing the master there and bowed her head in recognition. "I'm sorry, Dr. Henrique." She woke up agitated. "She is fine now." He looked for a moment before responding. "Thank you," he said simply. And it was a word that seemed to have a different weight than usual coming from him, as if it weren't pronounced frequently. Renata left. In the hallway she passed Viviane Montero, who had appeared at some point during the confusion, and stood a few meters behind Henrique, watching the same scene. The two crossed without a word, but Viviane kept looking at Renata's back until the employee descended the stairs and disappeared from sight. What Viviane had seen in that room was not new to her in terms of human repertoire. She knew what kindness was. She recognized compassion when she found it. What disconcerted her was the absence of any calculation in it. Renata hadn't helped the elderly woman because someone was watching. She had gone up because she heard a call and went. Simple as that. And that simplicity was what Viviane could least process, because in her experience nothing had ever been truly simple. In the following days, the tension in the house took a different shape. Enrique began arriving a little earlier, Sometimes he went up to see his mother before dinner, something he hadn't done regularly in recent months. On some of these occasions, Renata was still there, and they exchanged brief words about Donna Hercelia's state. He asked with genuine attention. She answered with clarity. There was nothing beyond that, but there was mutual respect, the kind that is born silently when two people recognize that the other is seriously fulfilling something that matters. Viviane noticed. She always noticed everything. It was a skill she had developed very early, even before she understood why. When you grow up in an environment where the absence of attention can mean being forgotten, you learn to monitor every look, every change in routine, every deviation in behavior. And Henrique's routine had deviated. It was nothing scandalous. They were details. But Viviane lived on details. She summoned Ghislaine one morning and, with the carefully neutral voice she used for important conversations, said, "I want a weekly report on the employee from the top floor. Schedules, attitudes, who she talks to." Ghislaine nodded without asking questions. She was experienced enough to know that questions could be more dangerous than answers. Renata, oblivious to all this, spent her days divided between Donna Hercelia's room and the small gestures scattered through the house that no one had asked for, but that she continued doing simply because it was her way of being in the world. One morning, she discovered that the gardener, So Dirso, had hands so calloused and cracked that he could barely hold the pruning shears. Without saying anything, she appeared with a tube of moisturizing cream she had bought at the condominium pharmacy with part of her own money. Dirso looked at the product, then at her, and was silent for a long moment before accepting. "My daughter used to do this," he finally said, his voice thick. Renata didn't ask what had happened to his daughter. She just said, "Apply it every day before work. It helps a lot." It was these gestures that Ghislaine noted in her little notebook. It was these gestures that reached Viviane in summary form, who read them with an expression impossible to decipher. And it was these same gestures that made Donna Hercelia, on a sunny afternoon that came through the open window, hold Renata's hand and say with surprising clarity, in one of her most lucid moments of that week, "You are good, girl. Don't lose that. The world tries to take it from us, but don't let it." Renata looked at the lady for a moment. Then she said with the simple smile that was the only honest answer, "You haven't lost it either, Donna Hercelia." The lady closed her eyes satisfied, and the afternoon passed like that, with the sun slowly descending through the window panes, and the silence between the two fuller than most of the conversations that happened in that house. Renata didn't know at that moment that she was being observed for the second time that afternoon, not by Ghislaine with her notebook, nor by Henrique, who was miles away in a meeting in the financial center of São Paulo. This time it was Viviane, who had gone up to get a shawl she had left in the upper-floor living room, and had stopped at the ajar door of the room unintentionally. She stood looking at that scene, the employee and the elderly woman hand in hand, the afternoon sun over them both, the peaceful silence that seemed to have its own texture. She stayed long enough to feel something that wasn't anger or jealousy, but was similar to both and at the same time was neither. It was more like the discomfort of someone seeing something that should exist in their own world and doesn't. An empty space that never had a name, but that now, before that image, began to ache in a way she didn't expect. She took the shawl and left without making a sound, and she descended the stairs with steps a little slower than usual. It was at the end of the 3rd month that the tensions began to organize themselves differently within the mansion, like the plates of an earthquake that hasn't happened yet, but whose movement is already perceptible to those who pay attention to the ground beneath their feet. Renata had become, without planning it, a presence that reorganized the space around her simply by existing the way she did. The employees had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the change was there. Edna began to hum while she cooked, something she had stopped doing years before. So Dirso began arriving a few minutes earlier, and sometimes there was a sprig of flower from the garden placed discreetly on the pantry door where Renata kept her work materials. The driver, Claudinho, a man of few words who had spent 12 years in that house without making friends with anyone, once offered a cookie from his lunchbox to Renata in the hallway, with the disconcerted gesture of someone who isn't sure if they are doing the right thing, but does it anyway. They were small things. They were everything. Ghislaine, to her surprise, had stopped writing in the little notebook. It hadn't been a conscious decision at first. She simply noticed one morning while opening the notebook to write another observation that she had nothing negative to record, and that what there was to record, Renata's gestures, the gradual change in the atmosphere of the house, would not serve the purpose for which the notebook had been created. So she closed it and put it in her apron pocket, and she went to make breakfast with less weight on her shoulders than she had felt in a long time. Viviane noticed the change in Ghislaine too. She noticed it in everyone, and it bothered her in a way she couldn't manage with the tools she possessed. On a Saturday afternoon, while Henrique was at a golf match with partners at the club, Viviane went up to the top floor for reasons she herself wouldn't have been able to explain clearly. She told herself it was to check if the elderly lady's room was properly organized, but when she reached the door and heard voices, she stopped. Donna Hercilia was talking. It wasn't the usual murmur of someone talking to invisible memories. It was a real conversation, with real answers, with rhythm and logic. Renata had brought a deck of cards and was teaching the lady how to play burraco, a game Donna Hercilia claimed to know, but whose rules she had mixed up with those of another game that perhaps didn't even exist in the way she described. The two laughed at the contradictions. Viviane stood in the hallway for a long time. There was something in that laughter of Donna Hercilia's that she had heard before many years ago, when she first arrived at that house as Enrique's girlfriend. The lady had welcomed her warmly and spent an entire afternoon sharing family stories that Viviane had listened to attentively, striving to appear present even when she didn't quite know how to be. But later, the illness had advanced, and the laughter had disappeared, and Viviane had stopped trying to climb those stairs because every visit left her with a feeling she didn't know how to name, between guilt and helplessness and something deeper she preferred not to examine. Now the laughter had returned, not because of her, because of an employee. Viviane descended the staircase and went straight to the blue room, where she sat looking at the garden for almost an hour without doing anything. It was very rare behavior for her, as she never sat still. But her thoughts found no direction. The confrontation she had mentally anticipated for weeks, Renata's dismissal on some convincing pretext, had lost the meaning it had before, not because she cared about the employee. It was something more bothersome than that. She had begun to realize that Renata wasn't the problem, and that removing Renata wouldn't solve what was truly wrong. What was wrong was older, and it was hers. That night, Henrique returned from the club with the quiet good humor of someone who had spent a day without urgent meetings. He found Viviane sitting on the porch with a glass of sparkling water, looking at the lights of the surrounding condominium. He sat down beside her. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "About your mother. I went to see her today." Henrique looked at her with a different kind of attention. "You went to her room?" "I stayed outside." A pause. She was laughing. Henrique was quiet. There was a lot in that silence, but he didn't pursue any of it. He just said, "Renata has been doing an incredible job with her." "I know," Viviane replied. And it was the first time in months she had said something about another person without qualifying it with a reservation. Henrique didn't comment, but he kept looking at his fiancée's profile with an expression that was careful, like someone who recognizes that something is changing, but doesn't want to make noise around the change for fear of scaring it away. Upstairs, after saying goodbye to Donna Hercilia with a kiss on the forehead that the lady received with a sleepy smile, Renata descended the stairs and passed the porch. She saw the two of them out there. She didn't approach, but she noticed Viviane's different posture, her shoulders a little less raised, her face turned toward the garden with an expression Renata didn't recognize in her because she had never seen it before. It was vulnerability. Small, almost imperceptible. But it was there. Renata went to her room, called her mother as she did every night, and while listening to Donna Aparecida's voice describing the day at the boarding house, she thought of something her mother had told her when she was younger and impatient, that the hardest people are usually the ones who need care the most, because hardness is always a protection for something that was once too exposed. She hadn't completely understood it back then. Now she was beginning to understand, and as she hung up the phone and the room darkened around her, Renata had the feeling that something was about to move in that house, something that had been still for too long, and that perhaps no one knew exactly what it would be like when it finally began to move. What she didn't know was that this movement had already begun in a room she had never entered, Enrique's private office on the upper floor, where he used to work on nights when his mind wouldn't let him rest. That night, after Viviane went to sleep, he went up there, opened the window that faced the garden, and stood looking at the scattered lights of the condominium. He thought of his mother laughing. He thought of the brief conversation with Viviane, her slightly different shoulders that I know that had sounded in a way he couldn't categorize. Enrique Montanaro had built an empire of precision. He knew how to calculate risks, anticipate movements, read spreadsheets and people with equal objectivity. But there were things inside his own house that he had stopped calculating so long ago that he no longer knew where to start again. His mother, sick and isolated on the top floor, his fiancée, controlling and distant in a way he had learned to accept as part of the package, the silence that had settled between the two without either of them having deliberately chosen to build it. A modestly paid employee, coming from a boarding house in Osasco, had arrived with a simple suitcase and had begun, without asking permission and without anyone noticing, to reorganize the air within those walls. Enrique closed the window slowly. He stood still for an instant, and he went to sleep with less weight on his shoulders than he had carried in a long time, without quite knowing why. The revelation arrived obliquely, as things that change everything usually do, not with fanfare nor with the dramatic weight one imagines they would have, but in a trivial moment, while life followed its normal course around it. It was a Monday morning, and Renata had gone up earlier than usual because Donna Hercilia had asked the day before for her to bring the photo book that was on the second shelf of the mahogany cabinet. The lady had said this with such precise lucidity, indicating the shelf by number and describing the color of the cover, that Renata was surprised for a moment before confirming she would look for it. It was a sign of how Donna Hercilia's state had improved in recent weeks. There was no cure for what she had, but there was quality, presence, and the doctors who came to the house for regular visits had already commented, with a professional caution that barely disguised their surprise, that the lady seemed more engaged with the environment than in previous months. Renata found the book where she was told. It was a navy blue cover album, with thick paper inner pages and photographs held by white corners, as used to be done in the past. She sat down next to Donna Hercilia, and they opened it together. The photographs were old in black and white on the first pages, colored and faded on the following ones. There were images of family, parties, beaches that could be any São Paulo coastline from the 70s. Donna Hercilia commented on each one with that characteristic mix of certainty and improvisation, sometimes naming people with precision, sometimes inventing stories that were perhaps distorted memories, sometimes simply staying silent with a smile that needed no explanation. Then they reached a photograph that made the lady stop completely. It was an image of a young woman with long dark hair, wearing a simple cotton dress, smiling at the camera with her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that was both shy and defiant. There was something in her face that Renata recognized immediately, without being able to name why. "Who is this Donna Hercilia?" she asked. The lady looked at the photo for a long time. Then she said, "It's Mariana, Conceição's daughter. She worked here for many years." A pause. Poor thing. Renata waited. She had learned that when Donna Hercilia said, "poor thing," with that tone, there was more to come if one had patience. Her father was mean, very mean. She grew up like that, afraid of everything. When she left this house, it was the best thing that happened to her. The lady turned the page. But she left something here that she never came back for. Renata didn't ask what it was. The conversation followed other paths, as it always did, and the album was closed when Donna Hercilia began to doze off with it still in her lap. But that photograph stayed in Renata's head all day. The young woman's face, the smile, shy and firm at the same time, the posture she recognized from somewhere she couldn't identify. It was at night, when she crossed paths with Viviane in the hallway near the living room, that the memory connected. The face of the young woman in the photograph and Viviane Montero's face had the same structure. It wasn't identical. There were decades of difference. One was young and without a constructed posture. The other was the woman formed by time and choices. But there was a resemblance there that was no coincidence. Renata stood still for a second longer than she should have. Viviane noticed. "What is it?" Viviane said, with the habitual cutting voice. "Nothing," Renata replied. "I'm sorry." And she went to her room with her heart beating in a different way. She didn't say anything to anyone. It wasn't her place, it wasn't her story, and perhaps she was mistaken. The resemblance could be a coincidence. The world was full of coincidences that people insisted on turning into narratives. But she had learned very early that some things that seem like coincidence are, in fact, the past trying to find a way to be seen. In the following days, she observed Viviane with a different kind of attention. Not one of judgment, one of tentative understanding. There was something in the way the woman moved through the house, in the way she rarely touched anything with carelessness, in the almost anxious precision with which she controlled every detail, that began to make sense in a different way to Renata now. It wasn't pride. It was the armor of someone who had learned early that the world punishes carelessness. One afternoon, Renata found Viviane in the laundry area, a place where the master's bride rarely appeared. She was looking at a piece of clothing with an expression Renata hadn't seen in her before: lost. It was just a blouse with a stain that hadn't come out in the wash. But Viviane kept looking at it as if it were an insoluble problem, and there was something in her posture that wasn't irritation. It was fatigue. Renata approached quietly. "Baking soda with hydrogen peroxide takes out that kind of stain," she said naturally. "If you want, I can try." Viviane turned her face to her with an expression between defensiveness and surprise. For a moment, Renata expected the cutting response that was the norm, but Viviane just looked at the blouse, then at Renata, and held out the garment without saying anything. Renata went to get the products. She treated the stain calmly, without rushing, rinsed it and hung it up. When she finished, Viviane had left. But she had left on the counter, folded, the blouse of another set that also had a smaller stain without saying anything, as if it were a request she couldn't formulate aloud. Renata treated that one too. It was a small thing. It was almost nothing, but in that house, it was an entire step. That night, Ghislaine sought out Renata in the service area with a look that was different from the usual, less monitored and more direct. "Dr. Viviane sent word that your time off next week can be extended by 2 hours, said the housekeeper. No explanation. She just sent word. Renata was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. "Thank you, Ghislaine." The housekeeper left without another word, but Renata stood in the service area for a moment, looking at the dark window that reflected her own image, and thought that sometimes the first word a proud person can say isn't "thank you." It's a gesture. And knowing how to recognize a gesture for what it is might be one of the gentlest ways to listen. She still didn't know what the photograph in Donna Hercelia's album really meant. She didn't know that there was a secret buried there for decades, carefully kept between the pages of a past no one in the house dared to open. She didn't know that the name Mariana, spoken by the lady with that heavy, poor thing, was the central point of a story that involved much more than the domestic work of a young woman in an Alphaville mansion many years ago. But the past, when it begins to be touched, doesn't stay quiet for long. And there was already someone in that house who was beginning to feel that the ground beneath their feet wasn't as solid as they had believed their whole life. Viviane Montero, that same night, stayed awake later than usual. Not because of the unusual gestures of that employee, nor by the weight of the thoughts she had tried to keep ordered. She stayed awake because there was a name she couldn't stop hearing inside her own head, a name that belonged to another person. Or perhaps, in a way she wasn't yet ready to examine, belonged to her as well. The rain that fell over Alphaville that Friday afternoon was the kind that doesn't warn. It arrived suddenly, heavy and closed, transforming the mansion's manicured garden into a dull mirror and making the gutters sing. Renata was in Donna Hercelia's room when the storm began, and she stood looking out the window with the lady beside her, both in silence, watching the drops draw crooked lines on the glass. March rain was always the most honest, Donna Hercilia said suddenly, with the serene voice of her lucid days. It has no pretension. It falls because it needs to fall. Renata smiled. You speak beautifully when you are in a good mood. The lady laughed, a short and genuine sound. I always speak beautifully. Not everyone has the patience to listen. It was in this peaceful atmosphere that Renata made a decision she had been avoiding for days. Carefully, without urgency, she asked, Donna Hercilia, that girl in the photograph, Mariana. You said she left something here when she went away. What was it that she left? Donna Hercilia didn't answer immediately. She kept looking at the rain. Renata didn't repeat the question. She waited. A story, the lady finally said. She left a story that was never told properly. What story was that? Another long silence, then. Mariana was a good girl, very good. She worked here for almost 4 years. Her father drank, hit her. She came here to escape. Here she was safe. Her voice got lower, but she left suddenly, without warning. And later, I found out she was expecting a child when she left. The room became quiet except for the sound of the rain. No one knew who it was? Renata asked carefully. They knew. I knew. Donna Hercilia turned her face to Renata. Her eyes were clear, without mist. The father of the child was my husband's younger brother, Augusto, who was married, of course, and was a coward, of course. He sent her away with an envelope of money and asked her never to appear again. Renata remained silent. I never knew what happened to that child, the lady continued. Mariana disappeared. Augusto died years later of a heart problem. And that story remained buried here inside me because there was no one else who wanted to hear it. She went back to looking at the window. The rain had slowed a bit. Why are you telling me this now? Renata asked. Donna Hercilia took time before answering. Because you remind me of her, not in the face, in the manner. She also didn't lower her head to anyone, but she was gentle. She was gentle without being weak. That is hard to find. Renata stayed with those words, stuck somewhere between her chest and throat for the rest of the day. At night, when she went to her room, she lay looking at the ceiling for a long time before sleeping. There was a child Mariana had taken when she left, without real money, without support, only with an envelope of shame and the need to start over. A child who would be close to 40 today. Renata did the math mentally. The timing matched, and the resemblance in the face she had seen between the young woman in the photograph and Vivian Montero kept pulsing in her memory with an insistence she couldn't ignore. But she also knew that insistences can be constructions, that the mind creates patterns wherever it is willing to find them, and that it was by no means her story to tell or investigate. What life decided for her was different. On Saturday morning, while Renata was passing through the lower floor reading room on her way to the kitchen, she found Vivian sitting alone with a glass of cold coffee in her hand and an open envelope on the coffee table. The woman's expression was the one Renata had seen least in her, completely unguarded. There was no hardness, no control. There was only a woman sitting with a paper in her hand and something on her face that was, undeniably, shock. Renata stopped at the door. She almost turned back. Come in, Vivian said without looking up. Renata entered slowly. She stood at a respectful distance. Vivian was silent for a long moment. Then, with a voice Renata had never heard in her, without a cutting edge, without controlled elevation, just a voice. Did you know? Know what, Dr. Vivian? The woman raised her face. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that was harder to bear than tears. The expression of someone who has just understood something that was before their eyes for a long time and they had never seen. That I grew up 10 kilometers from here, Vivian said. That my mother raised me alone in a 2-room house in Barueri with the name Vivian Marquez. That the name Montero I use is my adoptive father's, who came into my life when I was 7 years old. She looked at the envelope. My mother died last year. I never asked who my biological father was because she never wanted to tell, but she left a letter. The room became absolutely quiet. My biological father's name was Augusto Montanaro, Renata felt the floor of the room make a movement that wasn't physical, but that she felt entirely. Viviane placed the letter on the table with a calmness that cost a lot to maintain. "I am the daughter of Henrique's uncle, which means this house—" She looked around with an expression impossible to classify. "This house was always my family, long before I knew." Renata said nothing. There were no words available for that moment. But she stayed where she was, standing in the room, present, without fleeing the weight of that silence. Because sometimes presence is the only thing we can offer, and it is enough. After a long time, Viviane looked at her and said, with a voice that was almost another's, "Why didn't you leave?" "Because you didn't ask," Renata answered simply. And it was the right answer. Not because it solved anything, but because it was true. The silence that followed was different from all the others that had inhabited that room over the years. It wasn't the silence of control, nor the silence of intimidation, nor the silence that precedes an order or a criticism. It was the silence of two people who were, each in their own way, trying to understand what had just happened. Viviane looked at the letter again. Then she folded it carefully, as if the paper were more fragile than it was. She put it inside the envelope. She rose from the armchair with that bearing that was so characteristic of her, but which now seemed to carry a different weight, less performative, more human. "I don't want anyone to know about this yet," she said. Her voice had recovered some of its usual timbre, but the sharpness was missing. "I need to think." "Of course," Renata replied. Viviane went to the window and stood looking at the garden wet from the previous day's rain. The palm leaves were still dripping. The garden looked washed, as if something had been removed from the surface of everything. "Does Donna Hercilia know?" Viviane asked without turning her face. Renata hesitated for an instant. It wasn't a lie what she said next, but it was a careful version of the truth. "She told me about a young woman who worked here, and about a story that was left without an end. I think she always knew more than she showed." Viviane was silent for a long time. Then she said, almost to herself, "All my life I thought I was from somewhere else, that I had arrived here by accident, by choice, by ambition." A pause. "I never imagined that perhaps it was a kind of return." Renata didn't answer. There were moments when the right answer was to have no answer, and she had learned that not from any book, but beside an old lady with white hair who sometimes spoke more in silence than in words. When Viviane finally left the room, Renata stood still for a moment, looking at the forgotten envelope on the table. She didn't touch it. She never would. But she felt, with all the clarity of someone who has just witnessed something that has no exact name in the Portuguese language, that that house had shifted its axis on that rainy Saturday morning, and that nothing, from then on, would be exactly as it had been before. Henrique Montanaro arrived that Saturday afternoon, bringing with him the habitual weight of someone who had spent the morning resolving loose ends that never finished. He entered through the garage, greeted Claudinho with a nod, and went straight up to the office with the intention of checking some documents before dinner. He hadn't noticed anything different in the house. There was no way to notice, because the difference was still settling in layers that were invisible from the outside. It was Donna Hercilia who called him. He was passing through the upper-floor hallway when he heard his mother's voice, clearer than it had been in months, calling his name. He entered the room and found her sitting in the armchair with the photo book in her lap, the same navy blue cover album open to a page he recognized from a distance. "Sit here, Henrique." He sat on the edge of the bed before her, as he had done many times when he was a child and she told stories after dinner. The armchair had always been hers. The place on the edge of the bed had always been his. Some geometries of childhood do not change. "There is something I should have told you a long time ago," Donna Hercilia said, "about your uncle Augusto." Henrique was quiet. His uncle had been a hazy figure in his life, present in photographs and in stories, told with the typical reserve of someone who prefers not to go deep. He had passed away when Henrique was 22, and what remained in memory was less a person than a vaguely respected absence. Donna Hercilia told everything, with the precision of her lucid days, without ornament and without drama, just the facts in the order they had happened decades ago. Mariana, the hidden romance, the pregnancy, the envelope of money, the disappearance. The child who had been born without anyone in the family knowing where or how. Henrique listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, looking at the floor. "Why are you telling me this now, Mother?" Donna Hercilia looked at him with those eyes that, in moments of clarity, had a depth he had never quite known how to reach. "Because I think that child found the way back home." Henrique raised his face. "Ask Viviane," the lady said simply. "With kindness, with patience. The way you learn that important things are asked." He stood still for a long moment. Then he stood up, kissed his mother's forehead, and descended the stairs with steps that were slower than usual, like someone who needs time to reorganize what they know about the world before continuing to walk in it. He found Viviane in the winter garden, sitting in one of the wicker chairs with a closed book in her lap. She wasn't reading. She was looking at the plants with the distant expression of someone who looks without seeing. When Henrique approached, she raised her face and something passed through her eyes, something he didn't know how to name, but that made him sit in the chair beside her instead of standing. "My mother told me something," he began. Viviane closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she had made a decision he hadn't seen happen, but that was visible in the set of her expression. "I also need to tell you something," she said. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. There was no way it could be. There were decades of secrets buried in those words, a story that belonged to neither of them, but that affected them both in completely different ways. Viviane told about her mother's letter with a composure Henrique recognized as effort. She wasn't being cold, she was being careful, because she had learned that care and coldness sometimes wear the same clothes without being the same thing. When she finished, Henrique was silent for a long time. "Did you know before you met me?" he finally asked. "No, I didn't know anything." She looked at her hands. "I never knew who my biological father was. My mother carried this secret for decades. She only left the letter because I think she didn't want me to go forever without knowing." "So you arrived in this house without knowing you had blood here?" "Yes." Henrique processed that. It was information that reorganized a lot. It didn't necessarily change it, but it reorganized it. The woman who had become his fiancée, with whom he had built a life inside that mansion, had arrived there carrying a belonging that neither of them knew existed. It was the kind of irony life reserves for stories that haven't finished yet. "What do you want to do with this?" he asked. Viviane looked at the garden. The winter plants had that discreet resistance of those who survive the cold without making an alarm. "I don't know yet. I need to understand what this means to me before knowing what to do with it." "All right," Henrique said. And there was in those two words a quality Viviane wasn't used to receiving from him: space, the possibility of not needing to have the answer now. She looked at him sideways. "Aren't you angry?" "At what?" "At not having known before. At me not having investigated more when I could have." He spent a moment thinking. "You didn't know there was anything to investigate. It's not the same as hiding." Viviane was silent, and it was in that silence that something moved inside her that had been motionless for a long time. It wasn't exactly relief. It was something shyer than that, the feeling that the ground beneath her was a bit firmer than it had been an hour ago. That afternoon, while the winter garden cooled around them and the daylight grew lower, Henrique and Viviane sat without any rush to go anywhere. It was rare for both. They were people of movement, of agendas, of defined purpose. But there was something in that moment that asked to be lived at the pace it was arriving. From the hallway, Renata passed with a tea tray she had prepared for Donna Hercilia. She saw the two in the winter garden through the glass door. She did not disturb them. She went up with the tea, sat beside the lady who was dozing peacefully in the armchair, and stayed there watching the afternoon fall. And in that house that for so long had been ruled by fear, there was now, in several rooms at the same time, something that was different, still fragile, still without a definitive name, but real. Ghislaine, who had passed through the kitchen with the pretext of checking the pantry stock, stood looking at the winter garden from the hallway for a moment, long enough to see Viviane's different posture, the shoulders that weren't raised at the usual height, and Henrique beside her without a cell phone in his hand for the first time in weeks. The housekeeper walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer where she kept the little notebook, and stood looking at it for an instant. Then she threw it to the back of the drawer, under the folded dish towels, in a place where it would be forgotten for a long time. Edna, who was peeling potatoes in the usual pre-dinner silence of the kitchen, noticed the housekeeper's different expression upon entering but asked nothing. She just pushed a saucer with cookies toward her and continued what she was doing. Ghislaine sat on a stool and ate 2 cookies without saying a word. It was, by the standards of that kitchen, an extraordinary gathering. And upstairs in Donna Hercelia's room, the lady opened her eyes at the moment Renata thought she was sleeping. She looked at the employee with that gaze that on good days reached everything. "You did a good thing today," the lady said. "I didn't do anything special, Donna Hercelia. Sometimes doing nothing special is exactly the right thing." The lady closed her eyes again. "Good night, girl." "Good night, Mom." Renata stayed a bit longer, listening to the lady's breathing deepen into sleep. Then she turned off the bedside lamp with care and left the room on tiptoe, closing the door with the gentleness of someone who knows that some moments deserve to be kept whole. 3 weeks after that afternoon in the winter garden, the Alphaville mansion woke up with an unusual movement that the employees noticed before any formal explanation. There were fresh flowers in all the vases on the lower floor, not the millimeter-precise arrangements Viviane used to order from the florist who delivered on Tuesdays, but simple bouquets, almost wild, the kind one buys at a corner stand or picks with the eye instead of with a ruler. Edna, arriving to prepare breakfast, found the kitchen with a handwritten note on the counter, signed by Viviane, asking that the lunch menu include rice with chicken and potato sticks. Edna read the note twice, raised her head, looked around as if expecting someone to confirm she wasn't dreaming, and then put the water on to boil with a smile she didn't take off her face for hours. Ghislaine arrived shortly after and found the note as well. She was silent for a moment. Then she went to organize the day's schedule with a lightness that no one in the kitchen knew how to name, but everyone felt. Renata learned of the note when Edna called her to the hallway with that expression of someone who has news that needs to be shared carefully, so as not to deflate by being said aloud. When she heard it, she was silent for a moment. Then she just said, "Good. She will love it." And Donna Hercelia did love it. When lunch arrived at the room that day, served on a tray with a flower from the garden placed beside the plate, the lady stood looking at the set with an expression Renata had learned to recognize. It was the expression of someone who is being reminded that they exist and matter. "Who sent this?" she asked. "I think it was Dr. Viviane," Renata answered. Donna Hercelia looked at the flower for a long time. Then she said very softly, with the voice she used when she was being more honest than usual, "So she is, as I thought she could be." That afternoon, something happened that wasn't on anyone's agenda. Viviane went up to the top floor, not because anyone had asked, not because there was anything to check. She went up because she had decided, in those 3 weeks of inner silence that had followed the revelation of the letter, that there were things that only resolve when a person decides to go to them, instead of waiting for them to come to her. She knocked on Donna Hercelia's door with 2 light taps. The lady was awake, sitting in the armchair with the radio playing low in the background. "May I come in?" Viviane asked. It was the first time she had asked that at that door. "You may," Donna Hercelia said. Viviane entered and stood near the door for a moment, looking at the room like someone entering a space for the first time, even having passed through it before. Then, with a decision that was seen happening before it was thought, she went to the armchair and pulled the wooden chair that was at the small table and sat down beside the lady. "I came to visit you," she said simply. Donna Hercelia looked at her with those deep eyes of her lucid days. "You took a long time." Viviane didn't look away. "I know." They sat like that, one beside the other, with the radio playing, and the autumn afternoon coming through the window Renata always opened in the morning. There wasn't much to say, or there was everything, and neither of them knew yet where to begin. But the silence that existed between them at that moment was different from all the silences that had existed in that house. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was not the silence of protocol. It was the silence of two people who are beginning to understand that they have more in common than they imagined. It was Donna Hercilia who broke it first, in a way that was completely hers, without announcement, without preparation, going straight to the point with the honesty of someone who has no more time for beating around the bush. "You have Augusto's nose," she said. Viviane became very quiet. "He was handsome too, but weak." The lady paused. "You are not weak. You only learned to appear hard because no one taught you the difference. Viviane stood looking at the lady for a long moment, and then something happened that Renata, who had arrived at the door with the afternoon medication and stood still not wanting to interrupt, would never forget. Viviane Montero, the woman who for months had been feared by everyone in that house, closed her eyes, tilted her head slightly to the side, and let out a very small sound, almost imperceptible, that could be interpreted as a contained sob, or as the sound of something that had been stored for a long time finally finding a way out. Donna Hercilia said nothing. She just placed her hand over Viviane's hand with the quiet firmness of someone who knows that sometimes holding on is all one can do. Renata took a step back. She left the medication on the hallway table and went back to the stairs without making a sound. There were things that needed no witness, and there was a specific wisdom in knowing when to leave. That night, dinner at the mansion was different from all the previous ones since Renata had arrived. There was nothing spectacular on the menu, nor in the flowers, nor in the table arrangement. But there were Enrique and Viviane sitting side by side, speaking with a cadence that wasn't that of the pragmatic conversation of recent months. There was a space between their words that was different from the usual space. It was a space of choice, not of distance. And there was, in the chair Enrique had asked to be placed beside his Donna Hercilia, brought down for the first time in weeks to the lower floor, supported by Renata on one side and by her cane on the other, wearing a blue dress the lady had specifically requested because it was the color she wore at family parties when she was younger. When she sat at the table and looked around, the lady said, "This way, it is right." No one asked what she meant. Everyone understood. Renata stood at the entrance of the dining room for an instant before returning to the kitchen to help Edna with the trays. It wasn't her place at the table, and she knew that with the same clarity with which she knew she had been part of all that in a way that didn't fit into any conventional position. She hadn't saved anyone. She hadn't solved anything. She had simply been who she was, in the place where she was, in the way she knew how to be. And that had been enough for the things that needed to move again. In the kitchen, Edna was serving the rice into a dish with an expression of concentration that poorly disguised her satisfaction. Ghislaine was beside her arranging the glasses with more care than necessary, which was her way of showing that the occasion mattered. "It's different here today," Edna said without looking at anyone specifically. "It is," Ghislaine confirmed, with the brevity that was characteristic of her. Renata took one of the dishes and carried it to the room with a smile that no one was looking at, but that was there anyway. She had learned a lot in that mansion. She had learned that large houses can be small in love, and that love, when it enters, doesn't need permission to transform the space. She had learned that the most difficult people usually carry the heaviest stories, and that judging without knowing the story is always an incomplete equation. She had learned that kindness is not naivety. It is a choice one makes every day, especially on the days when it seems hardest. And she had learned, observing Donna Hercilia in her mornings of clarity and her afternoons of mist, that the memory of the heart is more resistant than any diagnosis, that love, when it was real, does not disappear completely. It just waits, quiet, for the moment when someone opens the window. 2 months later, Renata received a call from Donna Aparecida on a Tuesday morning while organizing Donna Hercilia's room. Her mother called to tell her that the doctor had said the treatment was responding better than expected, and that perhaps the sessions could be spaced out starting next month. Donna Aparecida's voice had a lightness Renata hadn't heard in a long time, the kind of lightness that isn't an absence of concern, but is the presence of hope. Renata hung up the phone and stood still for a moment in the silent room, with the morning light coming through the window she herself had opened earlier. Donna Hercilia still slept, her breathing peaceful, her white hair spread over the pillow. There was a very slight smile on the lady's face, the kind that appears when the dream is good. Renata sat in the chair beside the armchair and waited. There was no rush. The day was starting calmly, and she had learned to value calm starts because she knew they didn't always come. Life in the mansion had changed in ways that were both large and subtle. Viviane had returned to her office in the city where she worked as a high-level management consultant, but the days in the mansion had a different texture. She had hired a family lawyer to guide the legal aspects of the discovery about her origin. In a process Henrique had said he would support in whatever way was necessary. There was no drama. There was, gradually, the construction of something that had no ready name, but was taking shape as things built with care take shape. Slowly, with attention, without forcing the pace. Viviane's hardness hadn't disappeared. Renata didn't expect it to disappear, because she knew that isn't how people work. But there was something different in her hardness now. It was less a weapon and more a structure, like the difference between a wall built to attack and one built to protect something worth protecting. With the employees, the change was palpable. Edna had asked for the first time in 7 years for an afternoon off to go to a nephew's birthday, and Viviane had granted it without question. Ghislaine had reformulated the schedule system so that there was less overlap of shifts, reducing the stress of those arriving and those leaving. So Dirsu, with his hands hydrated and less painful, had begun working on an aromatic herb bed he himself had proposed, and that Viviane had approved with a brevity he correctly interpreted as discreet enthusiasm. Claudinho had bought a larger pack of cookies. On an afternoon in April, when autumn had already arrived seriously in Alphaville, and the air had that dry and golden quality that only happens at this time of year, Renata was in the garden helping Dirsu transplant basil seedlings when Viviane appeared at the porch door. She stood still for a moment, looking at the two in the garden. Then she descended the steps and walked there. She stood beside Renata, looking at the seedlings with an expression that was contemplative. "Are you going to stay here?" she asked, without looking at Renata, with the neutral voice that was her way of asking questions that mattered. Renata understood that it wasn't a question about the work contract. It was a question about choice, about belonging, about whether she wanted to continue being part of what that house was becoming. "For now, yes," Renata said, "as long as Donna Hercilia needs me." "And after?" Renata looked at the basil seedlings, small and green, and full of a quiet insistence on growing. "After, I'll see. But I think the after will take care of itself if I take good care of the now." Viviane was silent. Then she said, without preamble, "You are the strangest person I have ever met in this house." "Strange how?" Renata asked. "Strange because you don't want anything other than what you are doing." A pause. "That is rare." Renata thought before answering. "My mother always said that wanting too much at once prevents you from seeing what is in front of you. I learned to want what is in front of me." Viviane didn't answer, but she stayed a few more minutes in the garden before going back inside. And when she did, her steps on the grass were slower than usual, with the quality of someone who is paying attention to the ground they step on. Renata went back to the seedlings. Dirsu, beside her, worked in silence with firm hands and the precise movements of someone who loves what they do. The autumn afternoon sun warmed their backs without exaggeration, with the specific gentleness of a sun that knows the cold is coming and chooses to be generous while it can. Upstairs, in the room with the always open window, Donna Hercilia woke up from her nap, looked at the garden below, and spent a long moment observing the scene with a quiet smile. A young woman and an old man transplanting seedlings in the garden of a large house. A woman descending the porch steps with different shoulders, a late autumn afternoon that had nothing extraordinary and had everything. "This way it is right," the lady repeated to herself, with the conviction of someone who has said it before and knows it is worth saying again. And the house, which had been for so long a place where fear defined the rules, breathed once more with the lightness of someone who is learning, gradually, that love is not the opposite of strength. It is what strength becomes when it stops needing to prove anything. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Renata, Viviane, and Donna Hercilia has touched your hearts the way it touched ours. Sometimes the greatest transformation doesn't come from a grand gesture, but from someone who simply decides to be kind when everyone around them chose fear. If this story resonated with you, leave a like. It is the simplest way to say it is worth continuing to tell stories like this. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Every week we bring new narratives that explore what is most human within us: secrets, redemption, love, and the silent courage of those who do not give up on believing in people. And in the comments, tell us, which character from this story stayed most in your heart? We read everything. Until the next story.